I know.
Yes.
No worries.
Do you know when she's coming?
I don't know. Yeah, unfortunately. A show of hands. I just learned that the Queen's appearing. Who wants to see the Queen? Okay. What I suggest is I'll go through the lecture, but I'll have one person sit over here. And when the Queen shows up, so if I have a volunteer for somebody who wants to sit over here, keeping an eye out for the Queen, I'm more than happy to allow somebody to do that. And if she shows up, we can pause class and just go and stare and gawk. So if anybody wants to come and sit up here and sort of keep an eye out. Okay, if we hear the Queen come, we'll pause. Okay, so today we're talking about AI and the economy. AI, as I'm sure you're all well aware of, is this massively significant new technology. It sort of is looking like it's going to change the global economy in a number of different ways. What I want to do today is basically look at two ways that it's going to impact the economy. Automation, which is the focus of a lot of research, as we'll see today, but also centralization. So what I mean by that is that the very nature of AI as a technology leads to companies getting larger and larger and larger. So we'll look at that argument as well. Okay, so to begin with, I want to sort of look at some concepts that allow us to think about the relationship between technology and work. So if you get interested in this sort of research, you'll come across these ideas again and again and again. The first of these is the idea of skill-biased technology. So these are technologies which don't replace workers, but instead they augment workers. So they allow workers to do more than what they could previously do, or to do something different than what they could previously do. Now, a classic example here is a computer. So a computer allows people to do a lot of things which they weren't previously able to do, or to do it in a much quicker pace than what was previously available. Now, the important part of this argument is that the computer is not, it doesn't have equal impact on every type of worker. So some workers benefit from the introduction of a computer. Their labor is augmented, but other workers see no change to their work. So if you're an office worker, the introduction of a computer is a massive change. If you're a hairdresser, the introduction of a computer makes virtually no change to your job. So it's skill bias, the computer. it affects certain types of jobs, but not other types of jobs. Because it augments labor as well, it also means that the people whose labor it augments, they tend to get higher wages as a result. So people who are suddenly using computers, their wages are going up, whereas that hairdresser who isn't using a computer is seeing their wages stagnate. So we'll see that skill-biased technology has a role in inequality over the past 40 years. Actually, over the past 200 years, really, it's played quite a significant role. Now, in contrast to that, we have labor-saving technology, which, like the name suggests, completely replaces workers. So it doesn't augment them. It basically says you're no longer necessary as a worker. Classic example is industrial robots within a factory. Instead of having workers working on an assembly line, picking up pieces, modifying them, and then passing them along, instead you have these increasingly sophisticated and gigantic robots doing the same task. So industrial robots are a good example of a labor-saving technology. Now, computers are also a labor-saving technology. So the profession of being a typist used to be an incredibly popular position back in the 1960s and 1970s. Today, it's virtually non-existent. So today it doesn't exist anymore because we have a computer. Everybody can type themselves. They don't need somebody separate to type it up on a typewriter anymore. Final concept, and then maybe we'll go look out the window, is this idea of routine versus non-routine. So, let's go. Go for it. Yeah. I think she's headed inside now. She was wearing a coat. Okay. So we've talked about skill-biased technology. We've talked about labor-saving technology. The other core concept I want to talk about is this routine versus non-routine distinction. So certain jobs can be considered routine jobs insofar as you can set out a sort of clear, explicit set of steps for how to do that job. Again, a classic example is working on an assembly line where you have a part come to you along the assembly line, you pick it up as a worker, you modify it in some way, and then you place it back down on the assembly line, and it continues on. That is a pretty clear set of tasks to do that job. Now, what that means is that if a job is routine, it tends to be very easy to automate. We can program computers to do things if we understand the set of steps involved in doing that task. Now, non-routine jobs tend to be much more difficult, if not impossible, to automate. So an example again might be hairdressing. Why don't we have robots doing hairdressing? Simply because it's incredibly difficult to figure out what are the precise steps. How do you change according to every single person, change according to the weather conditions, if people's hair is frizzy or not. All these sorts of variables that go into cutting hair, which make it incredibly difficult to set out the steps that are involved. So, routine, non-routine is basically the distinction between what can be automated and what can't be automated. Now, let's look at the previous wave of automation. So this is from about the 1970s to 2000s. Machinery came in and changed the way in which the workplace operated, the way in which the production process was organized. The core thing that happened was that routine jobs were incredibly significantly automated throughout this period, particularly routine tasks involving manual labor. So most manufacturing in the advanced capitalist countries ends up being automated at this point in time. A good example of this is this chart here. So what this chart is showing is the blue line is how much of manufacturing America is producing. And we can see the blue line is going up and up and up, except for periods of recession. So America is producing more manufacturing, but the red line is the number of people employed in manufacturing. So even though they're producing more, they're employing less people within that sector. And the simple reason is because robots are coming in and allowing America to produce more and more and more. Now America and the US, the UK rather, and in some other countries are also moving manufacturing to China, but it's also being automated within these countries as well. Another example of routine jobs being automated, personal assistants in the UK dropped by 50% between 2001 and 2015, and typists dropped by 75%. So these jobs are basically disappearing as computers become more and more prominent in the 2000s. Likewise, the US has seen a similar thing, proportion of routine jobs dropping by 12%. So again, any sort of job where we could set out the explicit steps in doing it, particularly for manual labor, is increasingly automated over this time period. Now, what are the consequences of this? So we've seen the types of jobs which are automated, but what is the sort of socio and political and economic consequences of that? The key one, I think, is what's known as job polarization. Again, if you get into research in this field, you'll see this idea coming up again and again and again. It's a nice, simple way of describing what has happened to most labor markets in most countries over the past 40 years. What this chart is showing is that on the left-hand side, you've got very high-skilled jobs, and they've been increasing between 1980 and 2010. In the middle, that sort of low bump, that's middle-skilled jobs which have been disappearing. That's effectively routine work which has been disappearing. Now, on the right-hand side, you've got a large proportion of low-skilled jobs which have been increasing. So job polarization is the idea that middle skill, middle wage, or otherwise middle-class jobs have been disappearing. What we've seen instead is a handful of high-skill, high-wage jobs emerge, and a whole bunch of low-skill, low-wage jobs. So this has a direct expression in inequality. So if we want to explain why our societies are more and more unequal, automation has a big role to play in that. And again, this is something which is happening not just in America, but in basically every high-income country, and also every low and middle-income country as well. So across the world, routine jobs are disappearing, middle-class jobs are disappearing, and we're seeing some growth in high-skill and lots of growth in low-skill jobs. So that's happening in most countries. We also have the impacts of automation being felt by particular groups. So automation doesn't affect everybody equally. It affects certain groups more than others. So one key group in America that has faced actually a lot of the brunt of the impact is American men. If you look at 1950, what this chart shows is that about 90% of men in 1950s were working in the workforce. They had a job or they were searching for a job. By 2015, it's about 70% or lower. So that's a 20 percentage point decrease in the number of men who are working in the workforce. So that's a big shift. And part of the story there has to do with traditional male jobs, manufacturing in particular, disappearing. And they haven't been able to find jobs afterwards. This is why unemployment figures in America are actually fairly good if you look at the headline figures. But if you start looking at these sorts of stats, you see that actually there's a large proportion of people who are just not even looking for a job, not even working, which is a big problem in America. Another group facing concentrated unemployment is Black Americans and minorities in most countries. So the blue line is the rate of unemployment for Black Americans. The red line is the rate of unemployment for white Americans. And consistently, Black Americans face twice as much unemployment as white Americans. So they tend to be the last hired and the first fired in any sort of recession. So that is concentrated unemployment right there, which of course has impacts on levels of poverty, levels of health, levels of all sorts of things for Black population in America. So when we talk about technology and we talk about automation, we have to remember that it's uneven, the consequences. Some people do benefit from it, but there's a large group of other people who are suffering as a result. And all of this gets expressed as rising inequality. So this graph shows the amount of income overall going to the top 1% in the UK over the past century. And you can see that after World War II, we get the welfare state, we get redistribution, we get all these ideas about having a more equal society, and the proportion of income going to the top 1% declines as a result. 1980, Margaret Thatcher comes along, decides to undo all of that, and that's basically been continued ever since, to the point where the top 1% are now getting as much as they had back in the sort of golden age when they were taking a huge amount of money as well. So job polarization gets expressed as things like this, inequality. Okay, now more pertinent to you directly is the next wave of automation. So we've got job polarization in the previous wave of automation, but what does the next wave hold? When you get done your degree, will you have a job? Or what sorts of jobs will be available? First of all, the changes that are occurring, these are things that we're all well familiar with, but it's sort of nice to just articulate clearly what is happening. We've got three major changes which are leading to changes in automation. The first of these is big data, so the expansion of sensors around the world, just collecting more and more data. We also have the rise of machine learning, which can basically turn all that data into something useful. And then we have advanced robotics. So robotics, until relatively recently, wasn't very good. You can now YouTube, for instance, a video of a robot catching an egg, which is something which has only been possible in the last 5 or 10 years. And of course, we've got Boston Dynamics robot doing backflips and things like that. So all of this is major advances in what it's physically possible for computers to do. So that has a big impact on what tasks can be automated nowadays. Now, one thing that happens when economists look at the past, they look at the history of technology, automation, and unemployment, and they say, well, technology may take some jobs, but it creates new jobs at the same time. And so therefore, economists will argue that we don't see a lot of increased unemployment. Now, I think there are differences with this situation today. One is simply the pace of change. So something like a driverless car, 10 years ago, it was the common and established opinion that driverless cars were decades away, if possible at all. And of course now, in some cities, and I think even in London, you can go get a driverless taxi in some places. So what was a technology that was thought to be impossible 10 years ago is now something that's existing on our streets. So the pace of change is incredibly rapid. Developments in artificial intelligence are happening every single day. It's threatening to change a lot of the economy. Another difference from previous waves of automation is that we don't have a social movement pushing for a shorter working week. Now this is important because if robots are taking jobs, that means either more unemployment for a group of people or it means less work for everybody. So we can either get a certain group who doesn't work at all, or we can reduce the workload for everybody. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, we had a movement which pushed for a shorter working week. So if you were working in the 1890s, you were probably working a 60 to 70-hour work week. By the 1930s, that was down to a 40-hour work week. So a social movement pushed for a shorter working week, which meant that even if technology took jobs, took work, it was spread around equally. So it didn't mean larger amounts of unemployment. Another major difference between previous periods and today is that after World War II, governments looked at the devastation of the Great Depression and they said, well, we don't want that to happen again. And as part of our solution, we'll ensure that people are always employed. So they aimed for full employment. That doesn't happen anymore. That was sort of given up in the 1980s. And so that means that if technology starts taking jobs, governments aren't positioned to be able to get people back into work. And lastly, automation is pushing into new areas. So most automation throughout history has worked in manual labor, physical labor. Today, it's now taking cognitive jobs. So what we once thought was the sort of last preserve of human work now seems to be achievable by machine learning and other technologies. So I think just looking at history doesn't give us a good sense of what's going to happen in the future. Now, if you're interested, the BBC has this nice little app that you can go to. You can input any job that you want, and they will tell you the probability of it being automated over the next 20 years. So go look up your dream job and find out whether it's going to exist in 20 years or not. Fortunately, a lecturer is going to be around for a while, so I'm lucky. But yeah, it's quite interesting, the amount of jobs and the types of jobs which will be automated. So governments have become increasingly interested in what is going to happen with automation. So there's been a lot of research done into the potential impacts. In the UK here, the Bank of England did a study, and they found that up to 15 million jobs, or about 50% of the labor market, could be automatable within 2 decades. So that's a huge, huge segment of the labor market which could be completely gone in 20 years. The US has found similar facts, so 47% of jobs at risk in America. One study found that 45% of tasks are currently automatable with technology we have right now. So we don't even need to develop any new technologies, we just need to apply what we already have, and most work could be automated. That same piece of research found that if technology gains decent natural language processing abilities, it goes up to 58% of tasks could be automated. And if you've seen things like Google Duplex, you see the technology is very rapidly gaining some quite human-like natural language processing. So I think that 58% figure is probably more likely. Now, I should emphasize now, and we'll get into this more later, these are upper estimates of what is potentially automatable. They are not saying that 50% of jobs will be automated. That's an entirely different question, and we'll get into that a bit later. Now, that's rich countries. What I think is crucially important to note is, again, that automation is unequal in its effects, and the global south faces a much more significant impact from automation. So you can see China, 77% of jobs automatable, India, 69%, Thailand, 72%, and the highest I've come across so far is Ethiopia at 85%. So the developing world is going to face the most impacts from automation. And this sort of makes sense when you think about it, because what jobs do these countries mostly have? They have the low-skill, routine jobs that have been outsourced from the rich world. So low-skill manufacturing in China, low-skill routine IT work in India. These are jobs which could have been automated a while ago if there wasn't a vast source of cheap labor to use instead. So when we talk about automation, I think it's important to recognize it is a global problem. It's not just something for the rich countries to worry about. Okay, so what particular jobs are at risk? Well, a lot of low-wage, low-skill work is at risk. There is logistics work, so working in warehouses, moving goods around. Amazon is currently trying to build essentially a fully automated warehouse where goods are taken off from a truck, moved by robots, stocked by robots, picked up by robots, packaged by robots. At no point is a human supposed to be involved in that process. That's what Amazon is trying to do right now. Call center work is increasingly being automated, so you could have computers speak like humans to other humans. And a lot of office work, say data entry stuff, is increasingly automated as well. Now I've got a video. I didn't quite load it into this one. Let's see if I can find it. How many people know of or have used Ocado before? Only a handful of people? Okay, so Ocado is basically a UK-based company. It's a UK-based company for online grocery shopping. Amazon often gets a lot of the attention for fully automating their warehouses, but Ocado actually has the most fully automated warehouses that we've seen. So this gives you an idea of what exactly is happening. Each of these represents a different robot in the factory. So all of them moving about, sorting out orders, doing it all automatically. And of course, this used to be work that was all done by humans. So here you go. So if you ever order groceries from Ocado, this is how your order gets sorted out. A huge, huge warehouse just filled with robots. There's a number of places which also have what are called dark factories. These are places where effectively they just turn off the lights to save money. Because if the place is just filled with robots, robots don't need light. So you basically just turn off the lights and let the robots do their thing in the dark. So yeah, Ocado I think has the most impressive technology, and it sort of shows what the future of logistics holds for our economies. Okay, other work that's potentially automatable is a lot of routine manual labor that wasn't picked up beforehand. So things like work in factories, oil and gas, and steel production. Particularly significant is this little robot here called Baxter. And Baxter is unique because you don't need to program in advance what it's supposed to do. Instead, what it allows you to do is that you can pick up its hands, and guide it around to do the tasks. So you can actually train it physically to do the tasks that need to be done. So you don't need to really set out in explicit steps what it does. Instead, you just train it physically. So that means basically a lot of jobs which weren't automatable before are now becoming automatable. There's also professional jobs, and this is quite unique. So usually, professionals are doing such high-skill labor that they are not impacted by automation. But there are aspects of these professional jobs which could be automated. Lawyers are a good example. So a big task of being a lawyer is that If you have a new case, you might have to search through thousands of pages of case history in order to get a sense of the precedents and what's involved. Why do that when you could have a computer read all those pages for you and give you a quick summary of what they've learned? So that sort of task is being automated for lawyers. Doctors, increasingly there's the use of what's known as telemedicine. So doctors working in one country using robots to operate in a completely different country. We should mention this is skill augmenting or skill biased technology. So it's not replacing doctors, it's not replacing lawyers, but it's making them more productive. So we should expect that actually doctors are going to get paid more, lawyers are going to get paid more in the future, and hopefully professors will get paid more as well. We'll see. Another interesting example, I think, is finance, which has been sort of a major growth sector for, particularly for students looking for a well-paying job. Not necessarily a good job. I think jobs in finance are absolutely terrible. But it has been a place where you can make lots of money. A lot of it's now being automated. So there's things like high-frequency trading, which is machines making literally hundreds of thousands of trades in the blink of an eye. So every time you blink your eye, they're making 100,000, 200,000 trades, all done by computers. And then there's algorithmic trading as well, which is basically little AIs seeing opportunities in the market and making trades on the basis of that. There's a number of, say, UK government reports and other reports which suggest that finance is going to become increasingly automated and basically very few humans remaining, which may be for the better. So yeah. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I might have to speed through a little bit of the next part, running behind a little bit, thanks to the Queen. So impediments to automation. I mentioned that that research before says that up to 50% of jobs could be automated. But of course there's impediments to that actual figure being implemented. One is technical impediments. Robots are still bad at lots of things. As good as they can appear on a sort of nicely shot YouTube video from Boston Dynamics, there are still plenty of mistakes made by robots. They're particularly bad at things like perception and manipulation in what's known as unstructured environments. So a robot can pick up and manipulate things fantastically in a structured environment like an assembly line, where that object is going to be in the same place every time. It's going to be the same object every time. They know what to expect. What a robot can't do is pick up and fold your clothes. That is virtually impossible for robots to do right now. And the reason why is because a pile of clothes is going to be different every single time. It doesn't know what clothes it's picking up. It doesn't know how to fold it, how to manipulate it. It turns out that's an incredibly complicated task for a robot to do. It's literally impossible right now. Robots also aren't very good at creativity, so creative jobs are likely to continue on. And social intelligence. Robots are dumb. They may appear very, very smart, but they're fundamentally dumb. They have no idea about social cues or social context. You don't want a robot coming up to you and telling you that you have 6 months to live. You much prefer a human who's going to have that social intelligence to break that bad news to you in the right way. So that's technical impediments. There's also economic impediments. The core one here is cheap labor. So imagine you're a business and you have the opportunity to either buy this fancy new and expensive machine or to just pay for a bunch of cheap workers to do the same job. Most likely, you're going to have the cheap workers do that job. This has been the story of China's manufacturing for a long time, although that's changing now. China is now the biggest investor in industrial robots in the world by a long shot. So China is rapidly automating manufacturing precisely because wages in China have been rising up over the past 20, 30 years. So China is no longer a source of cheap labor for the rest of the world. The UK, though, I think the story of the UK right now is cheap labor. Wages haven't really budged for about 40 years in the UK, the average wage. Machines are expensive. And the biggest problem in the UK right now is that we're not automating enough. So companies are, classic example is fully automated car washing businesses. So you could drive it into these things and the machine washes your car for you, which are incredibly popular in North America and plenty of the world, but they basically don't exist in the UK because there's so much cheap labor here. So it's easier and cheaper to hire workers to do that same job rather than building an expensive machine to do the same thing. So that's an economic impediment. So long as we have sources of cheap labor, we're not going to automate. The other thing is that it takes a lot of money to invest in these things. So one piece of research looked at how much it would cost to replace the existing fleet of tractor trailers in America, to replace them with driverless ones, and their estimate was $320 billion. Now that may happen, but it's going to happen over a long period of time. So it's not something which is going to happen very rapidly. And if you look historically at how quickly technologies get adopted, the 90% adoption rate for technologies tends to take about 8 to 28 years. So we may be getting all these new technologies right now, but we may not see the impacts for 30 years. So that's another impediment. The final impediment is moral impediments. So we may have robots capable of doing something and doing it cheaply, but we may have sort of moral questions about whether or not we want them to do that. Do we want a robot to raise our children? I think it's an open question. I don't think we should instinctually say no, but of course there's a lot of sort of skepticism, justified skepticism about allowing a robot to do that. So as society, we're going to probably prohibit some automation simply because we think it's morally wrong. Now that being said, we do automate childcare already. We put kids in front of YouTube. We put kids in front of an iPad. That's a way of automating childcare already. So we're already doing it. Okay, very quickly, some of the problems posed by automation. Obviously, unemployment, if robots take a lot of jobs. There's also this idea of skills obsolescence. So new jobs may be being created by the economy, but they may require new skills, which not everybody can keep up with. So take, for example, a 55-year-old man who's worked in a factory his entire life, but suddenly that factory gets automated and he gets laid off. Now, there's plenty of jobs available for him, but they may require computer skills that he doesn't know how to do. So that requires this 55-year-old learning all these new skills, which is incredibly difficult at that point in their life. So skills obsolescence is basically the idea that workers can't keep up with the changing economy. Rising inequality, as I pointed out earlier, technology is skills biased. It creates job polarization, which leads to rising inequality. Okay, some possible solutions then. One solution which is really popular amongst policymakers is more education. This seems to be the dominant sort of response from policymakers. They say that, for instance, we need a continuing system of education. So education doesn't stop when you get done university. Instead, we need job training throughout life, which to me sounds absolutely terrible. I don't want to be in school for my entire life. Sounds like hell. Another argument, and this is made from the chief economist of the Bank of England, he points out that our current existing educational system is oriented towards cognitive skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which machines are all very, very good at, or increasingly getting very good at. So our education system right now gives us the skills that are being automated by machines. And he points out that's kind of a problem. So he argues that education might need to focus on giving people emotional and social skills instead. Allow machines to do what they're very good at, and other people can learn how to do things which aren't necessarily well done by machines. So that's, I think, quite interesting. There are some limits, though, to that idea. So what if the skills required change too rapidly? Again, it's very difficult to keep up with things if they're changing very rapidly. So if somebody asked me to use like TikTok as part of my job, I would have no idea. I would just be completely lost. I don't have the skills to do that sort of thing. Likewise, if you ask, say, my grandmother to do Python programming, she's not going to have a clue how to do that sort of thing. So we need to be aware that skills may change too rapidly for workers. The skills might also be simply too difficult for most people to attain. Not everybody can be a very competent Python programmer. It does take not just training, but some natural skill and abilities as well. The other, I think, core question is, are high levels of education even needed anymore? So when you look at the jobs that are likely to grow over the next 20 years, they tend to be care jobs. So social care, adult care, health care. We have aging populations, so we have lots of older people who are living longer and longer. They need to be taken care of. So the big job growth sector is care work. Care work, however, currently doesn't require a lot of education. It basically requires a high school education, and that's it. So policymakers saying, well, we need more education, completely misses that. So they may be trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. Another solution which I've argued for in my own work is to say that, well, automation and robots taking jobs is only a problem when our society is dependent upon jobs, when we're dependent upon work for an income. So my argument is that actually maybe we need to rethink society from the ground up, move towards a society that isn't based so centrally upon jobs and work. So I've argued for actually increasing automation. I think if robots can do all this work, if robots can take the place of a McDonald's worker, that's fantastic. McDonald's work is absolutely terrible. If you've ever worked in retail, it's absolutely terrible. Customer service work is terrible. Why are we forcing humans to do this horrible work? Let's get robots to do it. The way to sort of ensure that people can still thrive is to, first of all, reduce the working week. So spread the work around to more people as there becomes less of it. This also means that we all get more free time to do whatever we want to do. And then also this thing called a universal basic income, which is the idea that the government would provide everybody with, say, £1,000 per month, no questions asked, and it would allow you to do whatever you want to do without having to necessarily find a job. So in that sort of society, if we had all of that stuff, we'd have a lot of free time to basically do whatever we wanted to do. And robots would be doing all the laborious and tedious work that we don't want to do. It sounds great, but of course imagining us getting to that sort of scenario is incredibly difficult. But I do think it's worth thinking about these ideas. Okay, are there any questions so far? All right. So in the final 10 minutes, I'm going to very quickly go through the argument around AI's impact on centralization. Now, most research on AI's impact on the economy has focused on automation, taking jobs. To my knowledge, there's only a handful of people looking at its impact on the size of companies and how it's going to drive them to be larger. Part of this has to do with companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook now all moving to what they describe as being an AI-first company. So Google started as a search engine company. Amazon started as an e-commerce company. Facebook started as a social network company. They're now all AI companies, in my opinion. I think it's a misnomer to think that they're just about their sort of core business. Or rather, their core business now is AI. So all these companies are moving towards it. Why are they moving into this field? It's all about the Benjamins, of course. AI is an immensely profitable technology. So it is something which doesn't just apply to one sector of the economy, but instead is something which applies to the entire economy. AI is something which is going to change the way in which every aspect of the economy is done. So if you control AI, and if you are able to, say, rent it out to other businesses, that gives you a huge amount of profit and power over the rest of the economy. So this is why these companies are moving towards it. A good example is self-driving cars, which AI is basically the only way in which self-driving cars are possible. So think about, again, routine tasks. The reason why self-driving cars were thought to be impossible is because nobody could set out what are all the steps involved in driving a car. There's simply too many variables involved, too many unforeseen circumstances that are possible for self-driving cars to seem to be possible. It doesn't seem to be a routine task. Now with AI, what's happening is basically we have a huge amount of data, and AI can find the patterns that humans have not been able to find. So this is why it's become possible. It's been turned into a routine task by AI. Now the other thing these companies are getting involved in is cloud computing, which is a huge, huge market as well. So it's estimated to be around $260 billion in 2017, and to be worth around $411 billion by 2020. It's currently dominated by Amazon, but Microsoft and Google are rapidly trying to catch up, and also Alibaba as well around the world. Amazon, again, we like to think of Amazon as being an e-commerce company. It's no longer true. What you see here is the amount of profit. So North America, the top line, that's North American e-commerce for Amazon. Then there's international e-commerce for Amazon. And then there's Amazon Web Services, which is the cloud computing part of Amazon. And basically what you see is the top line. There's quite a bit of profit from North America, their e-commerce. The international one is taking billions of dollars of losses. And then Amazon Web Services, the cloud computing, is the biggest part, the biggest source of profit for Amazon. So Amazon wouldn't exist as an e-commerce company without their cloud computing sector. We can actually see that in 2017, all of Amazon's profits ultimately came from the cloud computing network, their net profit. So this is important. These companies, these massive companies, are turning to AI and to cloud computing. Now, how is AI changing them? The core sort of argument I want to make here is that AI is fundamentally a centralizing technology. The very technological requirements of doing AI mean that you need to have certain things which only the largest companies have and which they benefit from as well. Why is this the case? It's because contemporary AI feeds off of data. This may change in the future. It may not always be the case. But right now, machine learning requires huge amounts of data to train algorithms to do all the fancy things we see them doing. Now, what does this mean? AI fundamentally relies upon three things. Data, like I just mentioned, but also computing power. So to train an algorithm requires a lot of computing power. And who has a lot of computing power? Well, it's those companies with clouds, cloud computing. So one of the major reasons why Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft are getting into cloud computing is because it's also a way to do AI. Without massive amounts of hardware, you simply can't compete with Google, Amazon, or Facebook. The other thing that they need is talent. So people who can actually understand and train these things and actually develop new research, which is in short supply at the moment. So basically, only the top companies can afford the top talent because they're commanding incredibly high salaries. So what does this mean? Well, the top companies in the world are dominating in data, they're dominating in the hardware, and they're dominating in the talent. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. This, I think, is the really problematic thing that's happening. There's a positive feedback loop for companies. So if you get more data, compute, and talent, you get better AI. If you get better AI, you get better services and products. If you get better services and products, that company gets more users and more profit, but then that can then be put back into more data, more compute, and more talent, and the cycle continues on again. What this suggests to me is that the companies who are dominating in AI today are only going to become more and more powerful in the future. And nobody else is going to be able to catch up. So to give you one example, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon last year spent $68 billion on their basic infrastructure. No government in the world, not even the Chinese government, is spending that amount of money on AI hardware. So even the Chinese government can't catch up in terms of this sort of basic stuff. So basically we have a handful of companies which are increasingly dominating in AI and which look set to dominate the future of the digital economy. For me, this is a big worry, particularly as these companies move into increasingly important areas like healthcare, energy, and transportation. So do we want these companies to have that much power, and do we trust Google when they say they won't be evil? Is, I think, a big open question. So, I sort of skimmed through a lot of that, but we can discuss more in the seminars. Are there any questions, though, now? Okay, so next week we'll talk about the future of the digital economy. I'll also talk about assessments next week, particularly in the seminars. So if you have questions about your assessments or you have outlines, bring them with you next week and we'll talk about them.
Elle a pris. Je crois qu'on peut voir là d'ici. On est hyper bien placé là pour le coup. Quoi? Mais tu sais, les mecs, n'importe qui peut faire n'importe quoi par rapport à la personne. Ils peuvent avoir des armes. Elle-même, on voit que les photographes sont prêts niveau. Les photographes sont prêts. Bah, bien, yeah. Really, because the photographer are so ready. So, yeah. And look.